Good afternoon, and for those of you joining us from across the country and around the world, good morning and good evening. Welcome to the first webinar in our series on emotional well-being. I'm Amy Liebman, President of NTM Info and Research, and I will be serving as moderator for today's session. On behalf of all of us at NTMIR, thank you for joining us. The topic for today's webinar is Sleep Habits 101, and we are delighted to welcome Dr. Devin Smith as today's featured guest speaker. Dr. Elizabeth Devin Smith is a licensed clinical psychologist with more than a decade of experience researching and treating mental health concerns and psychosocial factors unique to chronic illness. She received her bachelor's degree in psychology at Oklahoma State University before completing a clinical psychology PhD program at Washington State University with an emphasis in health psychology. During her training and throughout her career, she has provided health psychology interventions in a variety of settings, including oncology, primary care, internal medicine, cardiology, pulmonology, and infectious disease. She received specialty training in sleep medicine treatment while working at the Georgia Cancer Center for 2 years. In 2018, she was recruited for a faculty position at Augusta University Medical College of Georgia, which involved creating a behavioral sleep medicine clinic. Currently, she's an assistant professor at National Jewish Health in Denver, Colorado, and works within the sleep medicine and NTM fields. During today's webinar, you'll be able to ask questions and answers. You type your questions into the Q&A at the bottom and hit send, and your questions will be read at the end of the session so that the speaker can answer them. Please join us for our upcoming presentations next month when we will launch our nutrition series with Dr. Michelle McDonald from National Jewish Health. And we will also have the second session in our mental and emotional well-being series on July 18th with Dr. Devin Smith. Don't forget to follow us on social media and sign up for the latest news at ntminfo.org. Dr. Smith, thank you for being with us today. I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Great. Thanks for having me, and thanks for the introduction. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you all. As Amy mentioned, I'm Devin Smith. I'm a psychologist at National Jewish Health here in Denver, Colorado. And so primarily what I do is help people that have difficulties with sleep. So that's the majority of my work. I do research and clinical work within sleep psychology. But I also help out in the NTM clinic doing psychosocial behavioral health evaluations. So if you've ever come to National Jewish for an evaluation, I may have met you before and talked with you. So it's really a blend of those two things that I primarily focus on. So sleep is near and dear to my heart. So this is something that I talk about all the time. So hopefully this answers some questions that you may have. So today, basically what I'm going to be covering is a little bit about sleep, because as we start talking about difficulties with sleep, it helps to understand some sleep basics. So a little bit about sleep stages, how sleep looks throughout the night. We call that sleep architecture. Also processes that interfere with sleep and control our sleep, and then how it changes across the lifespan, because we do sleep differently at different periods in our life. I'll also talk a little bit about insomnia, so what it is, what causes it, how we treat it, and then I'll get into some specific ways to improve sleep. And so my goal for this presentation is to hopefully get through this in 45 minutes to an hour and leave plenty of time for questions. So I'm going to start off by asking you all a poll. You should actually be able to vote now. I'll just give you another few seconds to answer if you haven't. No worries if you can't or don't want to. Okay, so the overwhelming majority of people in this webinar today are hoping to improve their sleep. And so I really do hope that I can give you some strategies that can help make sense of some of the sleep issues that you may be experiencing. So 84% of you want to know more about how to improve your own sleep. And then 4% of people want to help someone you know. Some people are interested in future sleep issues, and then 10% of you just want to learn more about sleep. So I hope to cover all of these in today's webinar. So let's get started. So you may have heard about sleep before. Typically, when I talk to people, they have heard that there's different stages of sleep, but people aren't very familiar with the specifics of the different stages. So when you go in for a sleep study, if anyone's ever done one, if you go into a lab and spend the night, typically what will happen is you'll have EEG electrodes connected to your head that measure your brain activity throughout the night. So it measures electrical impulses in your brain, and they look different during different periods of sleep. So when you're awake, so hopefully all of you right now would look like this if you were connected to an EEG. So these are beta waves. They're not very big. There's no real pattern to it. There's many waves per second. And so this is what typically your brain activity looks like just throughout the day. As you start to get drowsy, alpha waves start. So what that looks like is it's a little more rhythmic, a little bit more repetitive and less random, and a little bit slower. So you're not asleep at this stage, but this is, if you've ever been doing the slow blink, you're really starting to fade. When you're getting drowsy, this is what your brain activity would look like. The first actual stage of sleep is called N1, and these are defined by theta waves. N1 sleep is known as twilight sleep. So in twilight sleep, you may not even realize that you're asleep. So your eyes are closed, but you may have a sense of what's going on around you. You're kind of in and out of sleep. This is what that would look like. So in N1, it's slower, even more patterned than before. And if someone were to wake you up during this N1 stage sleep, you might say you are not asleep, but you actually have slipped into this first stage of sleep. Typically, we spend about 5% of our night here, so not very much of our night is spent in this N1 sleep, and it's really just serves as a bridge to deeper, more satisfying sleep. So this more satisfying sleep first starts occurring in N2 or stage 2. And this is a more satisfying sleep. We know we're asleep here. So if someone were to wake you up when you're in N2, you would be able to say that you were asleep. We spend a good percent of our night here. So typically 40 to 50% of our night is spent in this N2 sleep, and it is a more satisfying type of sleep. The actual benefits to sleep really start in stage 3 or N3 and then REM sleep. And so in N3 sleep, you can see how different these patterns are from even the stage before this. So it's also known as slow wave sleep, delta sleep, deep sleep, all names for the same thing, which is this N3 stage sleep. And you can see how slow the patterns are. So you're very, very much asleep during this stage. If someone were to wake you up, it would take you a few seconds to come to, you'd be groggy. Someone might have to try a few times to actually wake you up. And this stage of sleep is really important because it serves as the physical restoration for our body. So cellular repair, immune health functioning, all of that is happening during N3 sleep. So it's important that we get a little bit of this sleep, but we actually don't need very much. So we typically only spend 10 to 20% of our night here. And people don't consistently get deep sleep every single night. Particularly as we age, we get less and less deep sleep, and that's okay. That's considered normal. We don't need much and we don't need it every night, but we need just little bits of it. And our body really serves to protect this deep sleep because it's so important for our physical health. And I'll talk a bit more about that in the next slide. So if deep sleep is important for our physical health, REM sleep is important for our mental and cognitive health. So you may have heard of REM sleep before. It's called rapid eye movement sleep. And so if you've ever seen anyone in this stage of sleep, their eyes are closed and it looks like their eyeballs are moving back and forth very rapidly. And so in this stage of sleep, you can see that the brain activity actually, if you were to look at this awake sleep a little bit more zoomed in, it typically resembles awake. because our brains are very active during REM sleep. Typically, a lot of dreaming happens during this stage. Dreaming can actually happen in any of the stages, but it most consistently happens during REM sleep. And the dreams that we have during REM sleep tend to be more storyline dreams. So the type of dreams that you have during REM sleep are typically what people associate with normal dreams. So in REM sleep, all of our emotional restoration, learning, memory consolidation, all of that's happening during REM sleep. So this is very important for, like I said, our emotional and cognitive health. We spend 20 to 25% of our night here in REM sleep. And most commonly, when people have some component of sleep disruption or insomnia, they're missing out on REM sleep. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a bit. And the last thing to know about REM sleep is that we do come to our senses pretty quickly if someone wakes us up during this stage, because it's not as deep of a sleep, but it's still very important sleep. So like I mentioned, N1 and stage 2 are sometimes known as filler sleep. It's necessary to get to the good stuff. But stage 2 actually is, while it doesn't serve a purpose for physical or mental restoration, it does help us feel more rested. So that's a little bit more important, when you're comparing N1 and N2. And then, like I mentioned, N3 is all that physical health, physiological benefits. So this is a little image of what REM looks like. You can even see this in animals. Like if you've ever seen a dog dreaming, it looks like their eyes are moving back and forth rapidly behind their eyelids. Like I mentioned, psychological and cognitive benefits occur during REM sleep. And so it's pretty important for how we feel qualitatively. So how we report our sleep often depends on this REM sleep. Because if we don't get enough REM sleep, we feel, kind of emotionally uneasy, irritability, anxiety, low mood. All of that can happen if you're not getting enough REM sleep. And so I'll walk you through what we call sleep architecture. And so that's basically how our sleep is patterned throughout the night. So if you look at this graph, it's a little bit confusing, but it'll make more sense as I walk you through it. In the first 4 hours of sleep, we typically get all of the deep sleep that we're going to get throughout the night. So that's the first important thing to note. So deep sleep or delta sleep down here, remember that's the physically restorative type of sleep, and our body prioritizes it. So we're typically getting it in the first chunk of the night. Then in the second chunk of the night, so for this person in the second half, they're getting almost all of the REM sleep they're going to get. So the REM sleep is these red blocks. You can see that they get a little bit in the beginning of the night, but most of it comes in the second half of the night. And so let's say this is a person that sleeps from midnight to 8 a.m. So from 4 to 8 a.m., they're going to get most of their REM sleep. And so some people notice this because most of their dreaming occurs in the early morning hours or before they wake up. And that's because of how your sleep is structured throughout the night. And so the other thing I like to point out is this is a pattern for a young, healthy human. So this is someone that doesn't necessarily have any chronic health concerns. This is someone that doesn't have insomnia, sleep apnea, any sort of sleep issues. And this is someone who is, maybe mid-20s. So this changes as we age, and I'll talk more about that in the next slide. But overall, this is the pattern that we see even, regardless of age. Body prioritizes deep sleep in the beginning of the night, REM sleep in the end of the night. The other thing that I'll talk about here is how we cycle through these different stages. So it makes a little more sense if I walk you through it. So let's say, like I said, this person gets in bed at about midnight and they're awake, let's say for 5 minutes when they get in bed. They fall asleep pretty quickly. So you can see here they're awake for a short period of time, and then they slip into their first stage of sleep. So that twilight sleep. Remember, that's the type of sleep where you don't really know you're asleep. Um, it's not very restful sleep. And so they're there only for a few minutes before pretty quickly slipping down into N2 sleep or stage 2. And so that's the more satisfying sleep. You know you're asleep at this point. So, within 15 minutes or so, this person is in the more satisfying sleep. And they spend, let's say, 20 minutes or so here before slipping down into their first deep sleep stage. So you can see they're here for a big chunk of time, 30 minutes, 40 minutes. And to get to REM sleep, you actually have to cycle back up through the stages. So this person goes back into stage 2 for 10 minutes or so, and then they get their first little brief REM sleep, so 5 minutes or so. And then they have to slip back down into stage 2 to get back down into delta sleep. And you can kind of see this up and down movement throughout the night. So you're constantly cycling, not constantly, but with some regularity, you're cycling up and down through these stages during the night. The other thing I like to point out is this is considered normal sleep. And you can see that this person has several periods of wakefulness throughout the night, both at the beginning of the night, the middle of the night, and towards the end of their sleep. So that's considered normal. So when I work with my sleep patients, I always normalize waking up in the night. It's not uncommon, especially as we age, to wake up several times in the night. The trick is, do you fall back to sleep within a few minutes or does it take you a few hours? Because that makes a big difference. If it's, within minutes, you can see, let's say at 5:50, this person woke up, went to the bathroom, got back in bed, was awake for 5 minutes. That is a short amount of time. So they're able to slip back into stage 1 sleep just for a minute, and then they're right back into stage 2 for a few minutes, and then they get right into REM. So it almost serves to decrease the interruption of that period of wakefulness. Now, if someone was awake for an hour, they're going to have to basically start at the beginning and cycle through and spend more time at each stage to get back into the REM sleep. And so eventually what's going to happen if you have any sort of insomnia is you're going to wake up and you're going to cut off some of that REM sleep. That's what's going to be disrupted. So that's the other thing to note is not necessarily how many times are you waking up, but are you falling back to sleep quickly? Now, if you're waking up every hour, that can be more disruptive, but really you want to see how long are you awake in the middle of the night. Okay, so I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about the processes that control sleep. And there's 3 main processes. Most people have heard of one that I'll talk about, but the other 2 may be less known. So the first process that regulates sleep in our in humans is what's known as sleep drive. And so an easy way to think about this is like hunger. So in theory, the longer we go without eating, the more hungry we are. So in theory, sleep drive serves the longer we go without sleep, the more sleepy we are, the more we need that sleep. So let's say this is the same person that wakes up or goes to sleep at midnight and wakes around 8. So when they wake up at 8 a.m., their sleep drive is reset. They've just slept. They don't have a high drive or need for sleep. But as the day goes on, a chemical in their body called adenosine builds up throughout the day to increase sleepiness until they go to bed at night and they burn that adenosine that's been built up, they burn it off. So the trick here is that you need a good dose of this adenosine or this sleep drive to be built up in order to first fall asleep and then in order to sustain the sleep throughout the night. So something that can interfere with this sleep is, let's say someone takes a 2-hour nap in the middle of their day, they're burning off a chunk of this sleep drive. So even if they're able to fall asleep initially in the beginning of the night, their sleep drive probably isn't as high as it needs to be, so it doesn't sustain the sleep properly through the night. They might wake up. The other thing that can interfere with this is sleeping in. Let's say someone wakes up later, then their day has started later, and so it's going to shift the time it takes to build up that sleep drive till later. So someone who, sleeps much later than usual, or usual for them, might notice that they can't fall asleep as easily the next night. And that's because of this sleep drive. But it's not just sleep drive that's controlling sleep, because if it was, we'd be like cats. So would build up a little bit, would burn it off, build up a little bit and burn it off throughout a 24-hour period. But we don't function like that as humans. Something keeps us awake throughout the day as this sleep drive builds, and then allows us to burn it off at night. And that's this circadian clock. So that's the process a lot of people have heard of. So you may have read about it before or heard about it. And so the circadian clock essentially serves to keep us alert throughout the day, even as this sleep drive builds. So it's really the timing of our sleep. That's what the circadian clock regulates, is the timing of the sleep, so that we can stay awake through the day, even as sleep drive builds. And this is controlled by melatonin release at night. So it's not something that's pre-programmed in us. We're not born with a circadian clock per se. It's something that's trained by the environment. So that's why you can move across the world. You can move to Asia, or if you're in Asia, you could move to the US, but eventually you would adjust to that time zone. Might be tricky, but over time you would adjust to being able to sleep during that time zone. And that's because the circadian clock is something that can be trained. So when it's well trained, it allows us to know when to sleep and when to be awake. So the key is that this takes some repetition of waking up and going to sleep around the same time to be able to train our body to know how to function with the timing of our sleep. So if sleep drive promotes our sleepiness, you can think of this as controlling our wakefulness. So the circadian clock functions to where when this person wakes up in the morning, throughout their day, their wakefulness increases even as their sleep drive builds. And then at night, it's kind of like a switch is flipped and melatonin is released, and they're able to decrease their wakefulness to be able to burn that sleep drive off at night. So the important thing for our circadian clock, the most important thing, is light, specifically blue light. So that's something that you can get from sun, certain light bulbs. They make light boxes, but light in the morning or light when you wake up trains our circadian clock. So you may have heard recommendations to control the amount of light that you're exposed to at night, and that's certainly important. That can help. So if you're exposed to blue light at night, it essentially can prevent melatonin release. But equally important is exposure to sunlight in the morning. So that's one piece that people may not have heard. So opening your blinds, getting some sunlight exposure, it doesn't have to be direct, but around the same time every morning is going to help your body know when it should be awake, and conversely, when it should be asleep. And that's because our circadian clock lives in this little part of the brain called the hypothalamus, which is connected through the optic nerve to the eyes. So light really does train this biological clock. So, for people that live in dark spaces or keep their blinds closed, I always recommend to change that up a little bit. Sit by a window with some sunlight in the morning around the same time, and that should help over time with your circadian clock. And then the third process here that regulates our sleep is excessive arousal, or arousal in general. And this can be physical or mental arousal, such as trouble relaxing your body or difficulty shutting off your mind at night. If that's happening, it's going to impair your sleep. So you could have a great dose of sleep drive built up and a perfectly trained circadian clock, but if you have too much mental or physical arousal, it's going to be very difficult to sleep at night. So this is another process that regulates our sleep that we often have to talk about when I do sleep treatment. So, sorry about that. Let me go back for a second. So when we talk about good sleep versus insomnia or sleep disruption, Really, it comes down to these three processes, and that's where our sleep treatment comes in as psychologists or behavioral health specialists. So, when you have sleep that's adequate, you probably have enough sleep drive, your circadian timing is well trained, you wake up and go to sleep, around the same time every day. And you don't have too much mental or physical arousal at night that's interfering with sleep. But when we start talking about insomnia, one, two, or maybe even all three of these processes are off in some way. And so they need a little bit of focus and a little bit of coaching to be able to get those processes back where you want to promote good sleep. Okay, and so quickly about changes in sleep across the lifespan. As we age, we don't sleep as long or as deep. And this is considered normal. This is just how our body is built. So there's nothing necessarily wrong with this, but it's something that we have to think about because often expectations have to be adjusted. So in middle age, we have a drop in deep sleep. So around middle age, we also have a drop in REM sleep. You can see this is decreasing a bit as we age. So when you look at sleep recommendations, which is based on research from the National Sleep Foundation, from 18 to 25, 7 to 9 hours is recommended, but as little as 6 or as much as 11 hours might be okay. Then compare that to 26 to 64, 7 to 9 is still recommended, but as little as 6 may be okay. But now more than 10 hours is not recommended. There's actually some health risks that can come with getting too much sleep. Now, this does change with chronic illness. So if you're sleeping more than that with a chronic illness, that may not necessarily be detrimental to your health. And then over 65 or older, you can see that really the recommended sleep is 7 to 8 hours. So it decreases again, and as little as 5 to 6 may be appropriate, or as much as 9. So sometimes when I work with people in the sleep clinic, they come in with expectations that don't match how our body functions as we age. So that's something that you have to take into consideration is, what's a realistic goal for your current age and situation. Okay, so I'm going to do another poll here. So I'm curious how many of you have difficulty either currently or in the past on a regular basis. And so by regular basis, I don't mean everyone has, a night of poor sleep, but regular basis would be, at least 3 times a week for 2 weeks or longer. That's clinically how we define regular for sleep issues. But how many of you have difficulty falling asleep, staying asleep, waking up earlier than you want? And maybe some of you have never experienced these issues regularly. So I'm going to launch this poll just to get a sense here. All right, if you haven't voted but want to, go ahead and select an answer. Okay. So the overwhelming majority of you, 60%, have difficulty staying asleep. And so it sounds like your sleep is just disrupted through the night. So with difficulty staying asleep, you may not have a trouble falling asleep necessarily initially when you get in bed, but then it's hard to stay asleep through the night. 15% of you do have difficulty falling asleep, 19% waking up earlier, and good, 6% of you never regularly experience these issues. So I think that the staying asleep, hopefully we'll talk about some strategies that can improve that. Before we get into the specific strategies, though, it is helpful to know a little bit about insomnia. Um, it's a word that gets thrown around a lot. So you may, oh, I have insomnia. People say that all the time. But clinically, really, insomnia comes down to certain criteria. Um, so the first criteria is dissatisfaction with sleep quality or quantity. So note that it doesn't just have to be quantity. So someone doesn't necessarily have to sleep, a limited number of hours per night. You can have insomnia if you sleep 7 or 8 hours, but you feel like the sleep quality is poor. You're not feeling rested when you wake up. With the sleep, you have to have one or more of these issues. So that was in the poll. So difficulty falling asleep, staying asleep, or waking up too early and not going back to sleep. So one of those three criteria have to be met. And then you also have to have distress or impairment. And so that comes in with insomnia because some people are what we call short sleepers. So they may sleep 5 hours, but they're not concerned about their sleep. They don't have any symptoms of not enough sleep. It's not really a concern for them. And so typically I don't really see those people in my sleep clinic. I may see them if someone says, hey, you're not sleeping enough, this is concerning, and they come in, but they're not really concerned about their sleep. So this insomnia diagnosis isn't met unless there's that distress or impairment piece. So distress just means that you're concerned about your sleep. You're worried about it, you're, unhappy with it. And then impairment can come in a couple of different ways. So you're tired during the day, low energy, you're sleepy during the day. It's harder to concentrate. You might have some memory issues or attention problems. And again, that often comes in with not enough REM sleep. Mood problems or irritability. There can be some aggression or impulsivity. That's more common in children. Maybe you have work or school problems. So even if it's not noticeable to others, a lot of times people report to me that they feel like their quality of work is suffering. They can tell they're not on their game. Maybe it's causing some issues in your personal life with a significant other or friends. People are tired, they cancel plans, or sometimes someone's partner gets upset with them because it seems like they're not paying attention because they're tired and groggy. So these are just some examples of ways this can get in the way of functioning during the day. And then, like I mentioned before, these sleep issues do have to have some regularity for an insomnia diagnosis. So 3 or more nights per week need to be met in order to have this diagnosis. And so that's an important distinguishing feature, because it's not insomnia to have one night of poor sleep a week. That wouldn't necessarily meet diagnostic criteria. And that's because our sleep really does vary from night to night, and that's okay. It's when it's consistently an issue, so 3 or more nights per week. And then a duration of 3 or more months. So you have to have this problem pretty consistently for a period of time in order to meet this criteria. Another key thing to note here is that you have to have the opportunity for sleep. So if someone's working night shifts and they're not able to sleep during the day, that would be a different sleep diagnosis. That would be what we call a circadian rhythm disorder, not necessarily insomnia, because it's not really just this inability to fall and stay asleep. It's something that's preventing them because of their schedule. So you have to have enough time for sleep, and it's not a choice necessarily to stay up late or wake up early. It's something that seems outside of your control. Something to note too is a few years ago, we had an update in our diagnostic criteria, and now it doesn't matter anymore why you're having trouble sleeping. So before, you could only diagnose insomnia as primary insomnia if you didn't have something else going on that would interfere with your sleep, be it a mental health condition, a physical health condition. Now it doesn't matter. You could be having trouble sleeping because you have depression. You could be having these symptoms of insomnia because of a health condition. It doesn't matter anymore. Now you can receive this insomnia diagnosis despite whatever's causing it. Real quick, something to note here is that insomnia is a clinical condition, but that doesn't mean that sleep isn't important even if you don't meet criteria for an insomnia diagnosis. So more and more frequently, what we're looking at in research is what we call sleep health. And so these are things that can affect what we're seeing, your mental and physical health, sometimes as much as insomnia, but it's much more common for people to report poor sleep health than necessarily insomnia. So one research finding was that approximately 30% of the general population experiences these subclinical levels of sleep disruption. So that could be you're not satisfied with the quality of your sleep. Your sleep regularity is off. You're getting in and out of bed at different times. And so that's disrupting your sleep. The timing of your sleep. So you want your sleep. The goal is to have the majority of your sleep occurring between the middle of your sleep should be between 2 and 4 a.m. So if you think about that, that kind of defines the timing of your sleep, because you're falling asleep probably at what would be considered a normal time and waking up at what would be considered a normal time. Not spending more than 30 minutes awake during the sleep time, including falling asleep and any awakenings, that's sleep continuity. Sleep duration, so sleeping, between that 6 to 8 hours a night for most people, and then feeling alert enough throughout the day. So these are different factors of sleep health that may or may not coincide with insomnia diagnoses, but people may experience complaints about sleep health that are equally important. And a lot of these strategies can improve sleep health regardless of if it's full-blown insomnia. The same research study actually that I mentioned before found that I think it was 50% of people reported experiencing at least one symptom of insomnia on a regular basis, so at least a few nights a week. And so a lot of people have sleep issues, even if it's not full-blown insomnia. So what causes it? How does this insomnia or sleep disruption develop? And so this is a model that talks about chronic insomnia. And so chronic insomnia is something that lasts longer than 3 months. So it becomes chronic pretty quickly. In this model, we all have some element of what we call predisposing factors. So that's this little green box here. So all that means is that most people have some sort of biological predisposition that may make it more likely for them to develop insomnia. This could be your age. So as we age, we're more likely to have sleep issues. This could be your gender. So people born female are more likely to have sleep disruption or insomnia. This could be, medical conditions. So people with NTM may have harder time sleeping. So all of these things on their own don't necessarily produce insomnia. So insomnia is this little, the insomnia threshold is this little line here. And you can see just having predisposing factors alone doesn't necessarily mean someone is going to develop insomnia. Really what it takes is some sort of precipitating factor to push you over the edge to develop sleep disruption. So you can see here, this could be medical illness. This could be psychiatric illness. This could be stressful life events. But also it could be something good that happened in your life, but it resulted in a change. So a lot of times I work with people that, their sleep issues started around the time they had a child, or when they moved, or when they started a new job. So things that are, positive changes, but still a change and can disrupt your normal patterns. And so in this sense, you're pushed over that insomnia threshold and you start to develop issues falling or staying asleep. In the short term, pretty quickly, we start to develop what's called perpetuating factors. And so these are thoughts or behaviors that initially serve to help us with sleep loss, but over time end up making the problem worse. So it's kind of inadvertently uh, supporting the sleep issues. So examples would be napping. I'll pick on napping a lot just because it's an easy one. But if you nap during the day, like I explained in the sleep drive slide, that's going to decrease your sleep drive and probably make it harder to sleep at night. So during the day, if you take a nap, if you have the time and ability to do so, you may feel better. It's going to get you through the rest of the day. You feel refreshed. But then that night, you may have the same issues, problems falling asleep, staying asleep. And then it just kind of perpetuates the insomnia because the cycle keeps going. And so over time, as it becomes chronic, the insomnia, really all that's left are these perpetuating factors. So things that, like I said, serve to help you with the sleep loss, they're natural kind of answers when you're having these difficulties, but then they start to turn on you. They start to actually just make the problem worse. So really that's all that sustains the insomnia over time, because you can see even as these precipitating factors go away, or you get used to them, or you adjust, you know, there's still these sleep issues. And really, it's because of how you're handling the sleep issues often that can perpetuate those problems. So, our psychological treatment for insomnia really targets this blue box because I can't necessarily change your, precipitating factors, things that go on in your life. And I certainly can't change your, predisposing factors, genetics, biology. But what we can focus on is thoughts and behaviors that may be making the problem worse without really realizing it. So that's the good news, is that even if you have a chronic illness, your sleep can improve. It's not just run by biology and physiology. We can target it through other means. So kind of pulling all of this together, what we see in these perpetuating mechanisms often is unhelpful sleep beliefs. And so this is the CBTI model, which is a type of insomnia treatment, cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. This really relies on the understanding that beliefs impact our behaviors during the day, impact these sleep processes, and can make insomnia stick around. So I'll give you an example. That's kind of the easiest way to understand this. But if someone has a belief that they have to get 8 hours a night, or something really catastrophic is going to happen, whether or not that's true, it's not helpful for your sleep. So having this pressure of needing to get X number of hours of sleep per night, or else you're going to lose your job or your health is going to fall apart. A lot of people worry about getting dementia because they've read that that can be linked to decreased sleep. So you have this in your mind at night and you're laying in bed, and let's say that the clock is ticking and you're awake and you're not going to get that 8 hours. Then what? You're going to be distressed. You're going to be worried. You're going to be anxious. You might be frustrated. And all of that's going to make it pretty much impossible to sleep. So if you have that belief in your head the next day, if you have the time and ability to be able to take a nap, you might choose to take a 2-hour nap because, hey, you only slept 6 hours last night, but you can make up 2 of those with a nap. So yes, you may feel better, and it's serving to kind of sustain that belief that, okay, I avoided this awful catastrophic outcome by taking a nap and making up for some of that sleep. Well, that then inadvertently lowers your sleep drive the next night, and it keeps the insomnia around. So that's kind of how all of this is linked together. But there's other factors here that can absolutely perpetuate insomnia. So one of them is variable sleep schedules. So if you think back to the circadian clock slide, if you're going to sleep and waking up at all different times, it's going to be hard for your body to adjust to any sort of schedule, and your insomnia may be worse. And then we'll talk a little bit more about these different factors, but One is performance anxiety. So people can develop anxiety around their ability to sleep. So as bedtime gets closer, someone may get more and more anxious about their ability to sleep that night because of past negative experiences. And that's actually just going to increase your arousal and make it much harder to sleep. Conditioned arousal, I'll talk more specifically about that, but basically, you can train your body to be awake in your bed by spending a lot of time awake in bed. Attentional bias, people with insomnia or sleep disruption think about their sleep way more than people without these issues, which makes sense. Of course, we think about problems we're experiencing, but unfortunately, sleep is one of those things that if you create enough pressure around it, it becomes virtually impossible. So, focusing on sleep throughout your day, thinking about how your sleep last night may be impacting your mood or behaviors the next day, worrying about your sleep, the next night, things like that, focusing too much on it can increase your arousal and make it harder to sleep. And then sometimes people just have a hard time shutting off their brain at night. Either they're worrying or maybe even just thinking about random things, but those thoughts can make it difficult to sleep. It can increase your arousal. So CBTI targets all of these things. And so we'll actually move into talking a little bit about how we treat insomnia or sleep issues. So with CBTI, really we're focusing, like I said, on these perpetuating factors of chronic insomnia. So CBTI is very different than maybe some other types of therapy that people have experienced in the past. It's much more skill-based. So you actually learn strategies to take home, practice, and improve your sleep. So it's almost like a class, a tailored class, one-on-one class where you learn these skills and then implement them. Typically, CBTI takes about 4 to 8 sessions. And so that's not 4 to 8 weeks because typically our sessions are spread out more than that. So you may see a CBTI therapist once every 2 weeks, once a month. So it can take, some time to build these skills and improve your insomnia. And that's because it can take some time to see these changes. You're not going to implement these skills night one and then all of a sudden the insomnia is magically just cured. It's going to take some time and practice. And so different components we focus a lot on is behaviors around sleep, but also how we think about sleep and how we address worry, active mind, things like that occur at night and interfere with our sleep. So I want to get into specific strategies because I know we are approaching that 12 o'clock time. But real fast, I want to take another poll here. I'm curious if you think any of these are true. So with your sleep, maybe these are things that you do, maybe there are things you heard, but do you think spending more time in bed at night will give you a better chance of falling asleep? Do you think if you try hard enough, you can force your thoughts to be quiet at night? Do you think it's okay to watch TV in bed for a couple hours because it helps you relax? And should you sleep later when you make up for missed sleep? And so I'll give a few seconds here to vote. And if you don't think any of these are true, just don't vote. Okay. So looks like there's about 99 of you here and 36 of you voted. So I'm assuming some of the other people that didn't vote don't necessarily believe any of these statements. So The most voted one is if I try hard enough, I can force my thoughts to be quiet at night. Um, the second most honest one, most common one was I should sleep later when I can to make up for the missed sleep. And then the third was watching TV for a couple hours in bed is okay because it helps me relax at night. So these are all things that I commonly see in my sleep practice. And unfortunately, often they're sustaining the sleep issues. So it's not true in every case that these are issues. But what I always say is basically, if it's not broken, you don't have to fix it. But if you're having sleep disruption, then you have to start looking at what you're doing at night and how it might be impacting your sleep. So I know tons of people personally that sleep with their TV on. They fall asleep every night watching TV, but they have no sleep issues. They feel like they get a good amount of sleep and they feel rested the next day and they don't have any complaints or concerns. And so that isn't necessarily an issue then, if someone doesn't have any sleep problems. But if someone's falling asleep with the TV on every night, and they're waking up frequently or they're having trouble falling asleep, they're awake for long periods in the middle of the night, then you might have to look, is that impacting the quality of your sleep? So I'm going to start out by talking about some sleep hygiene, which is basically just tips and tricks that might improve your sleep, and then some sleep promoting behaviors. So some of you may have heard of these sleep hygiene strategies before. Typically, if you go to your primary care doctor or even one of your specialty doctors, they're going to throw out a number of these sleep hygiene recommendations. They're great. They work, in terms of improving the quality of your sleep. What they're not going to do is treat your insomnia. So this alone is not going to make your sleep or your insomnia go away. They're basically things that if you pair it with other behavioral changes could improve your sleep. So you may have heard get up and go to bed at the same time each day, not drinking or eating too much when it's close to bedtime, particularly important for NTM because a lot of times acid reflux or GERD is an issue. So you don't want to eat or drink before bed. Taking naps, if you do, keep them short, exercising, things like this. Like I said, going to bed in a dark, quiet room might help, but they're not going to be the answer to your insomnia issues. So what I always say for sleep hygiene is don't discount that these things can work, but don't get frustrated if you're still having sleep issues despite having a dark, quiet bedroom or exercising or, not keeping naps short. If you're doing these things and you're still having sleep issues, that's okay because this isn't the answer to all of the issues. Really, one of the most effective parts of CBTI is looking at behaviors that promote good sleep. So one of them is to set an earliest bedtime and latest wake time and follow it every single day of the week. So again, if it's not an issue, you don't have to fix it. But if it becomes an issue, if your sleep is an issue, then you might have to get more scheduled with your sleep, at least for a short period of time. You want to keep your initial schedule close to your baseline averages. So what that means is it can be helpful to track your sleep for a period of time to get a sense of when are you on average falling asleep? When are you on average waking up for the day? What people often see, or what I often see as people track, is that they're falling asleep and waking up at way different times than they expect. So someone may be getting in bed at 10, but then they read for 30 minutes or an hour. So then that's 11 before they start trying to sleep, and then it takes them an hour to fall asleep. So really, even though they feel like they're going to bed at 10, they're not falling asleep till midnight. And so that's a big difference. Similarly with waking up, people may stay in bed, let's say till 8, but often they're reporting they're waking up at 6 on average or 7. So really their wake time is quite different than the time they're getting out of bed. And so a good way to see what your patterns are is through this app. So I use this app all the time in my clinical practice. It's called Insomnia Coach. It's a totally free app developed by the VA with sleep psychologists. And it allows you to track your sleep each day. So you just do it when you download this app. It's available on Apple, Google Play, whatever platform you use. You just track your sleep by pressing this little plus button every morning when you get out of bed. And it asks you a series of questions. What time did you get in bed the night before? What time did you try to sleep? How long did it take you? Things like that. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be staring at the clock, thinking about all of this and recording details throughout the night. Guesstimates are fine. You generally know, did it take me minutes to fall asleep or hours? And those are the type of differences that are crucial for understanding your sleep patterns. It also has a training plan in here. So you can go through this, I think it's a 5-week training plan, and do CBTI, actually self-guided. So this is a great app. But even if you don't use it for CBT, the training plan and all that, even just for tracking your sleep, it can give you a good sense of when you're falling asleep and when you're waking up. And so once you get an understanding of that, you can start to set these bed and wake times. And so the key with the bedtime, though, is a lot of people set a bedtime and force themselves to get in bed and try to sleep at that bedtime, which isn't super helpful if you're not sleepy. So that's why we say it's your earliest bedtime, because if you're not sleepy, stay out of the bed until you feel like you can sleep. So if your bedtime is 10, let's say, is your earliest bedtime, but that comes and you don't think you could sleep, it's better to stay out of bed and wait until you feel sleepy enough to be able to sleep and then get in bed. It's going to shorten that time that you're laying in bed awake, which is crucial. Similarly, the wake time, that's your latest wake time. So let's say that you set it for 7, but you wake up at 6 and you're wide awake, you're not going to be going back to sleep, just call it. Get out of bed for the day. It's actually going to increase your sleep drive for the next night and probably improve your sleep for the next night if you stay awake from the time you get out of bed until your earliest bedtime the next night. Key here too is not compensating for missed sleep. So a lot of times people will adjust their wake time based on when they feel like they fell asleep the night before. Really, that can just end up messing with your sleep drive and circadian rhythm. So it's better to actually get less sleep one night to improve your sleep in the long run. So this is all said, though, with some degree of consideration that you don't want to be limiting your time in bed to less than like 6 hours. So even if you're sleeping less than that, still plan to spend at least 6 hours in bed, because recommendations don't want you spending like 3 hours in bed at night, particularly if you have a chronic illness. Similarly, what we're really trying to do is decreasing your time in bed that you're awake. So you may have heard of classical conditioning before. Basically, in the 1800s, this guy named Pavlov, who you may have heard of before, did this experiment with dogs where he would present the dog with food, ring a bell, and the dog would drool. And so if he repeated that enough, presenting the food and ringing the bell, pretty soon, all that it would take is ringing the bell to make the dog drool. So he had conditioned the dog to respond to the sound of this bell. Same thing can unfortunately happen with our beds. So if you're anxious, if you have a bad night of sleep, you're frustrated, you're tossing and turning, you're anxious, you're not going to be sleeping. You're going to be awake. Now, if you pair this often enough with the bed, you're basically pairing the bed with being awake, with this anxiety state. And so over time, all that it takes is getting in bed, even if you don't feel anxious or worried or frustrated, all of those negative emotions, even if you don't feel it, now you're just getting in bed and you're wide awake. So this can happen a lot of times when people tell me that they're dozing on the couch, they're falling asleep, they're very sleepy, but then they get in bed and they're wide awake. Some of you may have experienced that before. A lot of times then people question, well, is it, walking from the living room to the bedroom that's waking me up, or, what's going on with that? really, it's none of that. It's the conditioned response. You've conditioned yourself to be awake in bed by spending too much time awake in bed. So this next recommendation works to decrease the time that you're awake in bed. So you want to eliminate sleep incompatible behaviors and get out of bed when you can't sleep. So when you're in bed, try not to read, watch TV, eat, use your phone, think, worry, problem solve. Don't do that in bed. And if you find yourself doing it, you can give yourself a little bit of time. The rule of thumb is 15 to 20 minutes. But if you can't quiet your mind after that time, get out of bed. Go do something that's, somewhat low key. Can be reading, you can watch TV, that's okay. But something low key that you can then get back in bed when you feel sleepy and try again. So basically, you do want to plan what you're going to be doing, because you don't want to be thinking in the middle of the night, like, oh, I have to get out of bed. What am I going to do now? I coach my patients to have a spot set up in their living room, have your book, have, your show picked out in your mind, whatever, so that if you have to get out of bed, it's already set up and you already know what to do. Some people ask me, well, how do I know 15 to 20 minutes if I'm not watching the clock? Because watching the clock can create anxiety, so we don't want you doing that. The answer is typically if you've been alert enough that you know you're not asleep and you're starting to feel frustrated, anxious, concerned, you're tossing and turning, your discomfort is increasing. Those are all keys that it's probably been a prolonged period of time and it's time to get out of bed. So those are good cues. And you can stay out of bed for 5 minutes. It doesn't have to be a long time. If you get up and get out of bed, this happens for me when I follow my own advice. If I have to get up and I go down into my living room, I open my book, pretty soon within 5 minutes, I'm doing the slow blink and it feels like I can sleep and then I can get back in bed. So it doesn't have to be for a long period of time. That being said, you don't want to fall asleep in another location, because that's not helping retrain the bed to be a place of sleep. Now you're just training yourself to sleep outside of the bed. The goal with this is to recondition yourself to sleep in bed. So it involves catching yourself before you're sleepy enough to actually fall asleep and getting back in bed. Now, if there's physical limitations that make it difficult to get out of bed at night, so people that are on medications that make them uneasy on their feet, if you have a lot of pain and discomfort and just can't realistically get out of your bed, that's okay. There are modifications to this. The recommendation is then to make your environment in your bed as different as possible from when you're trying to sleep. So that can mean sitting on top of your comforter, maybe pulling up a different blanket, propping your pillows up, or moving, if you have a movable mattress, sitting it all the way up. So creating a very different environment than the environment you try to sleep in can sometimes be enough to recondition yourself to sleep when you're in then the sleep position. And the goal is to stay consistent with this. If you only follow this some of the times, you're not going to see that reconditioning happen. It really has to be every time you're awake for a prolonged period of time, you're getting out of bed or repositioning yourself until you feel like you can sleep. And then the goal is that you're not going to then sleep later because you spend an hour out of the bed in the middle of the night. You still wake up at that latest time, and you still wait until that earliest bedtime. But then that next night, your sleep is probably going to be much better. So you're actually working with the decreased sleep to improve your sleep in the future. This is a long-term strategy, not a short-term one. So you may feel worse the next day, but it's going to help you in the long term. Okay, so I'm coming up at an hour, so I'm going to go through these next strategies pretty quickly. But I'm also happy to share this information. If Amy has a way to send this out, there's also going to be a mental health brochure or pamphlet that comes out that's going to include some of these tips and tricks. I was one of the co-authors on it. So even if we don't have a lot of time to get through all of this, you will have other ways to access the material. It's also in that Insomnia Coach app. A lot of it includes these recommendations. So one way that helps with quieting an active mind is to create a buffer zone. And so that's basically a transition period between your goal-oriented activities of the day and this more quiet, peaceful time of sleep. A lot of us go, go, go all day, even if it's not physically, mentally, we're just going all day. We're busy, we're thinking about things, we're doing tasks, we're playing on our phone, we're watching TV, whatever, we're staying cognitively busy. And then we get into the bed, turn all our devices off, lay down, and it's like the first period of quietness our mind has had all day. And so that's a difficult transition to go from go, go, go to just quiet nothing. So what can help is 30 to 60 minutes before bedtime, you create a routine where you're going to start to unwind, doing something different than what you typically do during your evening. So even if it involves watching TV or reading, which you typically do in the evenings anyway, maybe you dim the lights and you just have one lamp on so that it's a quieter environment. Maybe you do a relaxation exercise or some light stretching. You create this routine to where you can start to transition into this quiet time versus going from one extreme to the other. That can help. The other thing that can help is trying to shift the timing of your worrying. So if you're someone that notices that you worry a lot at night, either when you wake up or when you are trying to fall asleep, having this preemptive strike for nighttime worry can be helpful. Often, if we try to force our thoughts to follow, a certain pattern, it does the exact opposite. So if we tell ourselves, don't think about this, don't think about this, we're not very good at cognitively avoiding certain topics. So really the next best thing is trying to shift what's actually going to happen no matter what to a different time so that it's not disrupting your sleep. So in this exercise, what you do is you select a time each day when your brain is reasonable and you sit down and you worry. Like that's your goal, is to sit down and worry for 20 to 30 minutes in a quiet, distraction-free environment at a time that's not the middle of the night. So typically what we recommend is do this sometime, not first thing in the morning, because you want whatever comes up throughout the day to come up, but not too close to bedtime. So you don't want to bring this directly into bed with you cognitively. So typically early evening, late afternoon tends to be a good goal. So, right before, right after dinner, you sit down and you list out all of your problems, your concerns, your worries, your thoughts that are just circulating in your head. Everything you can think of that might come up in the middle of the night, you're listing that out on a piece of paper. But then you're taking it a step further because you're going to do this in a problem solving constructive fashion. So next to the problems, you're going to come up with a plan of attack. What do you need to do to solve this problem? Sometimes when we see something on paper, we realize it's not a problem at all. So that's your solution, is this isn't an issue right now. I don't have to think about it. I'll revisit it if it becomes an issue. Sometimes the problem can't be solved. So if it's something that either you can't change, whether it's someone else's behavior or, a health condition that you're not going to be able to get rid of, then the next best thing is, okay, how can I learn to live with this? How can I cope with this? How can I move forward with my life despite whatever this is? And so thinking a little bit about that and coming up with some strategies. Getting advice from other people. If you have no idea how to solve a problem, who can you talk to see if they have any thoughts or ideas? So these are all things that you can write down as solutions, even if it's not one final solution. And then what you do is you place this list or notebook, wherever you're doing it, on your nightstand so that it's there as a physical reminder if these thoughts come up in the middle of the night, that you've already thought about it today. You're going to think about it again tomorrow. You don't need to think about it right now. And over time, if you do this enough, your thoughts really do start to follow to, this worry period versus disrupting your sleep in the middle of the night. Okay. Another thing that can help is mindfulness. I'm not going to go through this in a lot of detail, but basically, mindfulness is just the idea of focusing on the present moment. A lot of times, our worries are based in either the future, worrying about what's going to happen, or the past, worrying about something that's already happened. Very rarely do we have reasons to be worried in the actual moment that we're worrying. So, what can be helpful is to reconnect to the present moment. So, one way to do that is what we call a grounding technique, a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You try to point out 5 things you can see, 4 things you can feel, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, 1 thing you can taste. And so, it's just a little trick to reestablish your connection to the present moment. Because often when we start worrying or thinking, we lose sense of what's going on around us. You may have noticed this, like if you're ever driving and you don't remember how you got to the place you arrived at, um, that's because you're in your head. You're not really connected to the present moment. So when you notice these thoughts or worries occurring, even in the middle of the night, reconnecting to what's going on around you. Can you feel the shirt on your skin? Can you feel the mattress beneath your body? Trying to focus on things that you may not have been aware of because you're in your head. And then the last strategy I'll talk about is just de-escalating your thoughts. So we call this, decatastrophizing, because when we worry, we often snowball. It's not just, oh, I'm a little worried about, this one thing. It's doom and gloom. I'm worried this is going to happen and it's going to cause this chain reaction. And pretty soon my life is going to fall apart. And so, what can be helpful is breaking down this worry and really thinking about the worst possible outcomes and how likely that is to actually happen. It can help us slow down and stop this avalanche or this snowball effect. So, what are you actually worried about in that moment? And you're not doing this in the middle of the night, by the way. This is something you could do during your worry time. But, what if something bad happens? What if your health never gets better? What are these what ifs? And try to be specific about it. My health will never get better. Maybe that's your worry. Really try to drill down and understand what are you predicting that's going to happen, and what is that actual concern? And then reassessing how likely it is to happen. How awful would it be if it did happen? And let's say the worst thing did happen. So if for this person, they never get their health back, how would you cope? How could you handle that? And so typically with this type of exercise, it helps you to, like I said, de-escalate the situation. So it doesn't mean that you're happy and carefree about this worry. So for this person, never regaining their health, but it seems less catastrophic. So they realize that they have some resources to be able to handle it. And then you kind of de-escalate this catastrophe that you've been thinking about in your head. So real fast, before I get into question and answers, I'm going to do one final poll here. I would like to know, what is one way you can commit to improving your sleep within the next week? So this is for people that are having sleep issues. So out of the techniques that I talked about, what do you think you could try in the next week to be able to help with your sleep? So the sleep hygiene I talked about, sleep-wake schedule, trying not to do things that are not sleep-related in bed, getting out of bed when you can't sleep, creating that buffer zone, practicing that worry time, trying some mindfulness or de-escalating your thoughts. All right, I'll give you another 5 seconds or so. So if you want to answer, go ahead and answer. Okay, great. So a lot of you, the majority, said that you're going to try getting out of bed when you can't sleep at night. That's great. That has been something that consistently helps my patients pretty quickly. Um, some of you, the next largest percent said that you're going to practice that constructive worry. Fantastic. These are all great strategies, but the important thing is to pick something and try it. And don't give up if you don't notice an improvement in a night or two. It's going to take some time and some practice. Okay, so that's all the talking I'm going to do for today. I went a little longer than I said I would, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get right into the Q&A. We have a patient asking, how long do I wait after their evening treatments to go to sleep? So I guess after they take their evening medicines.
So that really depends on what you're taking. Were there any specifics on, are you talking about antibiotics or?
Well, I'll invite them to post a clarifying
Okay.
question or comment, but they were probably referring to NTM related treatments.
Yeah. So you definitely want to follow your medical guidelines. So if you're supposed to take this at X time, it depends also on, do you notice side effects within a certain amount of time? So if you notice after you take a medication you feel nauseous for the next hour, for instance, maybe then you shift your bedtime a little bit later to account for that hour, so you're not spending an hour in bed miserable, because you're not going to sleep when you are very nauseous, for instance. So accounting for those difficulties and setting your bedtime realistically to account for that.
Okay. We have a question actually about cannabis, and I know this is a relatively new area of research in terms of development of therapeutics, but they were asking, do you know anything about what might be the best medical cannabis oil for sleep, whether it be CBD, THC, or a hybrid?
Yeah, I get this question a lot in my practice, and unfortunately, we just don't have enough research to know. So, one of the issues currently with cannabis and sleep is that the research that that is, grant funded, you must use one strain of marijuana out of the University of Mississippi. So that's all that gets researched. And as you might know, if you live in a state where cannabis is legalized, you've ever been to a dispensary, there are thousands of different strains, different percentages of THC versus CBD versus the components of the THC. So it's a very complicated picture, and we just don't have enough information to know, what are the short-term and long-term effects? Is this a good answer for sleep over time, or is there some side effects and consequences? We just don't have that research. So typically what I recommend to people is always check with your medical team before trying random substances. You don't want to interfere with, whatever medical treatment you're receiving. But if you get the green light and they say it's fine, typically they're not going to tell you to smoke anything. But maybe they, say an edible is okay, or oil. It's really going to be trial and error, and it's going to vary from person to person. If you're someone with anxiety, typically THC can actually increase anxiety. So maybe it's not the answer for you if you have a lot of just baseline anxiety. And it is just going to be trial and error. So trying out different things and seeing what works for you. But yeah, that's really my recommendation with THC and CBD.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Question about Concerta, a drug called Concerta. Can taking a drug like Concerta disturb your sleep?
Yes. So any stimulant medication, or anything that has wake promoting agents, so Concerta, Adderall, I'm blanking, Strattera, Vyvanse, modafinil. So things like that, they can absolutely disrupt your sleep. That doesn't mean you can't take them. You just need to be very intentional with when you take them. What is the half-life of that medication? So how early do you need to take it so that it's not disrupting your sleep at night? Also with medications like Concerta, Adderall, there are extended release and immediate release. And so checking with your provider that maybe you'd do better with an immediate release version so that it's not, lasting 12 hours in your system and disrupting your sleep. So absolutely check with your provider about that if you're having sleep issues.
Okay. Somebody's asking, I work with a person who physically fights while sleeping and strikes any other person in the bed. Any ideas for them?
1000% get a sleep study. So there is a REM behavior disorder. And so if someone's acting out their dreams, you absolutely want to get them in for a sleep study. And there are two types of sleep studies. You can do a home sleep study, which typically is great for checking out breathing, oxygen levels at night, sleep apnea. But if you want to look more at this like REM behavior disorder, you would need to do an in-lab sleep study or a PSG so that we can look at brain activity throughout the night. So that would be my biggest recommendation, because if there is an element of that going on, it typically needs medication.
Okay. If Fitbit says you usually have fair sleep, does that indicate insomnia if someone is often fatigued during the day?
Oh, Fitbits. Okay, so this is another common question. So any sort of activity tracker, Apple Watch, Fitbits, there's tons on the market. They're not great at actually reliably measuring your sleep. Unfortunately, they're just not there yet, despite whatever they claim. There's even ones that are made and designed specifically to measure your sleep. At best, it's probably giving you an overview of your sleep, but it's not detail specific. So they sometimes try to say, this is the percent of deep sleep you're getting, this is the percent of REM. At best, they're guesstimates, because really the only way to quantify those stages of sleep are through EEG with, like I said, electrodes on your head. So really they're looking at heart rate, movement, things that it can track on your wrist. And those are not things that can 100% reliably tell you your stages of sleep. So if your sleep quality is rated as moderate or poor, if it doesn't match with how you're feeling, I wouldn't be concerned about that. But if it's saying that and you're also not feeling rested, then I would maybe talk to your provider to see if, there's something that you can do. Try some of these strategies, evaluate what's going on. But I wouldn't panic just because your activity watch is saying something about your sleep, because in one research study, it showed that it misrepresents your sleep up to 50% of the time. So sometimes people toss and turn a lot and they're actually asleep, but your Fitbit thinks you're awake. And then sometimes if you're completely still, even if you're awake, it thinks you're asleep. So it's just not a perfect science at this point.
Okay. We have a question about melatonin. They're asking about the daily use of melatonin, and also if you know anything about the dosing for it.
Yeah, so throwing this out before I say anything, I'm not a prescribing provider. So I have a doctorate in psychology, a PhD, not an MD. So I don't write prescriptions or anything like that. I can speak a little bit to this just because I'm involved in it on a day-to-day basis, but always check with your medical provider when it comes to medications, even over the counter. A lot of times there's an assumption that because it's over the counter, it's safe. But a lot of these over-the-counter medications can have interactions with other medications. So check with your pharmacist or your prescribing provider. That being said, a lot of research does support melatonin use. It doesn't work for everyone, but it's certainly something that's typically safe to try. In our sleep clinic, we actually recommend a brand called REM Fresh. You can buy it on Walgreens, Walmart, Amazon. It's no more expensive than other brands. I don't have any contracts with REM Fresh, REM Fresh, but they produce data that shows the dosage and the contents in those dosages, because one of the issues with supplements is they're not FDA regulated. So if you get Costco brand, Trader Joe's brand, whatever brand melatonin, you don't actually have any idea the dose of melatonin that's in there, because it's not regulated. So try something like REM Fresh. You don't need a lot. So if you're just trying to use it for insomnia, 3 to 5 milligrams is typically fine. It's not something that the more you take, the more it's going to help. If that dose doesn't help, it doesn't mean that a higher dose will. And typically, if you're taking it for insomnia, people will take it right before bed, hoping that it makes them sleepy enough to fall asleep. But it's actually just going to help with your circadian clock or your timing of sleep. It shouldn't put you to sleep. It should make it more likely when you lay down, you actually fall asleep. So the recommendation, which isn't even on most bottles that of melatonin, is to actually take it 2 to 3 hours before bedtime. So, if your bedtime is 10, try taking it at, 8 o'clock. It shouldn't put you right to sleep, but it should make it likely that there's enough melatonin circulating in your system that when you lay down at 10, it's more likely you will fall asleep.
Thank you. And a
Yeah.
follow-up question that's actually going into supplements and prescriptions. You mentioned that you don't prescribe, but do you know of any other supplements or prescriptions that you would talk about with a patient or recommend for long-term sleep issues?
Yeah. So unfortunately, there is not a lot of research that supports other supplements like magnesium, valerian root. Patients take all sorts of supplements. If it works for you and it's not harmful, great. That doesn't mean you need to stop. It just, there isn't enough research that I can say that supports these supplements. That being said, I would be very cautious about long-term use of medications like ZQuil, over-the-counter diphenhydramine, so same active ingredient in Benadryl. There was a large-scale study that came out a few years ago that linked regular chronic diphenhydramine and similar medication use to dementia. So it's not a great solution long-term, despite whatever they say, it's safe for long-term use. It might not be. So I'd be cautious about that. When I talk about prescriptions, the medications like Ambien, benzodiazepine, Xanax, all that stuff is fine in the short term, but it's probably not the long-term answer for sleep issues. But there are some safer long-term options. Trazodone, Remron, these are antidepressants that actually have a side effect of making you sleepy. So now they're a safer prescription option because the side effect is making you sleepy. So you could ask your provider about medications like that.
Okay. And there's actually a follow-up question about melatonin. Does taking a melatonin supplement prevent your body from making its own melatonin naturally and making you dependent on it?
No.
Okay.
There have been some concerns about that, but research doesn't support it. And I've actually asked one of our sleep MDs about this, and it's not a substantiated concern at this point.
Okay. Somebody's asking, can I play chess on my tablet if I can't sleep, or is that too stimulating?
No. So you actually don't want to be completely bored, because if you just sit down in your living room, just totally unengaged and bored, you're more likely to sit there and worry about the fact that you're not sleeping. So you want to be somewhat engaged, but the trick is it's almost like Goldilocks, find the right dose of engaging but not overly stimulating. So you don't want to be reading a page turner that you absolutely can't put down, and now you're going to stay up till 4 a.m., trying to finish the next chapter or binging the next, episode on Netflix. So if you can play around a chess and kind of take it or leave it, but you're engaged enough that you're not thinking about not being asleep, that's probably fine. The one recommendation I'd have is, if you're going to be on a screen, so with a TV, it's far enough away typically that the blue light isn't a major concern. If you're going to be on a tablet or a phone, just put the blue light blocking feature on. So it's the nighttime mode. If you turn that on, you'll notice the screen looks a lot more yellow. And that's actually helpful because it's filtering out that blue light that can disrupt your sleep.
Okay. Somebody's asking, does Parkinson's disease cause insomnia?
Cause, I don't know if I would say cause, but they're definitely related. In fact, with Parkinson's, you can see some of that REM behavior disorder that I talked about, oftentimes that predates the REM behavior or the Parkinson's diagnosis. So sometimes that's the first indicator of a disorder like that. So yes, there is absolutely a connection there. And that's a case where you might, you'd want to talk to a sleep provider, because you might, there are medications you can take that we wouldn't necessarily recommend for long-term insomnia management for other people, but for people with Parkinson's, it may be appropriate.
Okay. Somebody's got another question about an electronic reader. They wanted to know if it's bad to read with before bedtime. I guess going back to the nighttime mode, you would just recommend putting it on nighttime mode?
Yeah, it
And maybe
depends if
not,
it's,
not a
yeah, if
page
it's
turner.
backlit. So some of the Kindles are, they look like paper. It's not backlit. So that has no effect necessarily. But if it's backlit, like the screen is light enough that you could turn off the lights and read it, then you might need to look into some of those blue light filtering options, or maybe decrease the backlighting.
Okay. We have a question about obstructive sleep apnea and using a CPAP. How does that affect your sleep?
If you're able to tolerate it, it's wonderful for your sleep. So we see insomnia and sleep apnea together all the time. And so I really recommend use of CPAP, because there's a number of issues with sleep apnea. One is that it's going to wake you up more often. So even if you're not aware of it, it's going to be disrupting your sleep throughout the night because you're essentially not breathing properly. Two, it also alters the structure of your sleep. So even if you do fall asleep, you're less likely to get into the stages of sleep that you need. You're more likely to kind of stay in that stage 2 sleep, which may be refreshing, but it leads you, or it may be, satisfying that in that you've slept, but you feel tired during the day, or you're sleepy, or you have other symptoms during the day. And that's because you're not getting the stages that you need or the quality of sleep that you need. And so if you're able to treat that sleep apnea with a device like CPAP, the quality of your sleep is going to improve so much. You're going to feel much more rested. And even if you don't, because some people, it's not the solution that fixes everything. Pairing it with some of these other behavioral strategies may be helpful. And then also knowing that it's also decreasing your risk of things like stroke, heart disease, some really, scary consequences that can happen with not treating sleep apnea.
Okay. Somebody's asking, what if you wake up very early and you're up the rest of the night, and then the next day you're exhausted when you're already fatigued? What do you recommend as a strategy for that?
So build in a nap. So like I didn't mention specifically, but naps are okay. You just want to keep them, if you can, to 30 minutes or less. And the important part is to place it 7 to 9 hours after you wake up. So a lot of people know don't take a nap right before bedtime, but it's also important not to take it too close to when you wake up, because essentially your body can't distinguish. If you wake up and then go right back to bed a few hours later, it just seems like a continuation of your sleep state, and then your circadian clock is off. So you want to have it 7 to 9 hours after you wake up, and try to keep it as short as possible. Even if it can't be 30 minutes, like if you feel like you need a little bit more than that, okay, can you do 45 minutes or an hour versus 2 or 3 hours? So any little improvements you can make by not having it too long can improve your nighttime sleep, but also help you get through the day.
Okay. We have a patient who's asking about the sleeping position. So she's concerned about her spine not sleeping in the flat position, because supposedly that's when your discs get more of their lubrication between the discs. But they don't, if she doesn't go to bed until 3 hours after eating, so that she has an empty stomach, is it okay for her to move to a flat position in the morning for a few hours?
I mean, so I don't want to override what your medical provider probably told you. They would probably say, no, you need to sleep in this position all night. But that being said, if that's what it takes to get you to be able to sleep in the position, for at least most of the night, then I would say it's a compromise. Sleeping a few hours in that flat position is probably better for you than sleeping all night in that flat position. So, it's kind of a give and take. What can you compromise with to make that change possible?
Okay. Someone's asking about low dose benzodiazepine and how does that prescription affect the overall quality of sleep?
So, like I said, it's good for short-term use, not great for long-term use. Typically, what we see is that it takes more of the medication over time to put you to sleep. I'm actually involved right now in an NIH-funded study that is involved in helping people taper off of medications like benzodiazepines. And we haven't statistically analyzed the data because we're still in the current clinical trial. But at least what I've seen is that a lot of times people have a lot of sleep issues, even though they're taking a sleep medication. And so then you really have to question, is that medication even helping at that point? And how much is it helping? But one of the reasons why we don't recommend things like benzos for long-term use, there's a number of reasons, but one of them is it does alter your sleep architecture. So people on a benzo typically get less REM sleep. So you may be sleeping longer, but what's the quality of that sleep that you're getting?
Okay. Somebody's asking about the role of blue waves when watching films for 2 or 3 hours online before they're sleeping. Is it detrimental?
Like blue waves, like blue light.
I would guess that that's what they're referring to. Yeah, what light waves.
Yeah, I mean, it can be. There's certainly research to support that blue light impacts your sleep quality. So making just little changes can help. It doesn't mean that you have to stop watching it, but could you watch it on a TV instead of a device? Because think about where you're likely to have your computer or your iPad. It's typically, like right in front of your face. Now, I don't know many people that sit directly in front of their TV. So that you're a little bit removed from, that might be better. If you're watching it on a device, can you dim the light? Can you turn on the night mode? Things like that might be helpful. And then my recommendation is typically try to decrease your screen usage in that buffer zone time. So that 30 to 60 minutes before bed, don't be, on a screen consistently that has a lot of blue light. That might be a good time to kind of cut that off.
Okay, we have a two-part question. In your experience, do most NTM patients have trouble sleeping, staying asleep, or have insomnia? And do you think NTM or any chronically ill patients should do a sleep study if they're struggling with their sleep?
1000% yes. I am a strong proponent of sleep studies. They're not needed for insomnia. We don't diagnose insomnia with a sleep study, but because people with NTM, have, pre-existing pulmonary issues, you want to make sure that you're getting the oxygen you need at night and that you're getting, you're breathing properly at night, because there have been some suggestions that maybe people with NTM are at higher risk for hypoxia, low oxygen levels at night, or sleep apnea. So it can't hurt to rule that out. I can't say everyone with NTM has sleep apnea, but it may be a higher rate. And so it doesn't hurt to rule it out, first of all. And second, what was the first part of that question? I'm sorry.
Is it your experience that a lot of NTM patients have trouble with their sleep?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I wouldn't say everyone. No, I meet plenty of people in the NTM clinic that I see for an evaluation, not for sleep, just for general psychological well-being. And, people say their sleep is fine. So it's not necessarily if you have NTM, you're going to have sleep problems. But yes, I do see a good percentage of people with sleep issues. There isn't a lot of research out there to say the percentage of people with NTM that have sleep issues. Maybe that's a future area for research. But I certainly think it's worth exploring if you are having sleep issues.
Okay. And then a follow-up question from someone who'd previously asked about their sleep patterns of waking up very early and being up the rest of the night and exhausted the next day. sometimes they said sometimes they move to the sofa and it allows them to fall asleep. But then if they're then if they wake up, they might move back to their bed, but they still feel tired because of the disrupted sleep. So, what would you tell them to do at this point?
So, I mean, if I was treating you in clinic, my first thought would be to track your sleep using something like that sleep diary on the app, because I'd be curious, what are your actual sleep patterns? A lot of times people are scheduling way too much time in bed compared to the time they're actually sleeping. So, if you're sleeping 6 hours, for example, but you're scheduling 12 hours to be asleep, that just doesn't match. Your sleep efficiency is very low, and that can increase insomnia issues. So you want to more closely match your time in bed to the time you're actually sleeping, which may mean going to bed later or getting up earlier, but the quality of your sleep is going to improve because you're essentially consolidating it. So that would be my first thought, is to really look at how much time you're spending or scheduling for sleep versus how much time you're actually sleeping, and making adjustments there so that hopefully you're decreasing prolonged periods of time awake in the middle of the night.
Okay. Somebody was asking that what are the names of the two antidepressants you had mentioned that are used for sleeping?
Oh, trazodone and
Trazodone,
Remron.
trazodone, and Remron. Okay.
Again, these are just things that we see in the sleep clinic that people tend to use. You of course want to ask your provider about that.
Mm-hmm. Is so somebody's asking about the hours that they're sleeping in terms of the time that like
Hmm.
like the actual like when they're going
Yeah.
to sleep and when they're waking up, because it looks like it's an 8 hour time period, but they're asking, is there anything negative about going to sleep at 3 a.m. and waking up at 11 a.m.?
Yeah, so no, not necessarily. So yes, that's outside of the quote unquote normal time that people might, have for their sleep. And I see people in my clinic that do want to make changes to the time they're sleeping because it's disrupting their life. So if it's causing you issues like, you're missing work or not making, doctor's appointments, or, it's just not consistent with your lifestyle, then you might have to change it. But if it's something you can get away with, you're retired, you can schedule afternoon doctor's appointments, no, it's not an issue. Um, where it does become an issue is if the timing of your sleep completely flips. So there is some research that shows, going to bed at 9 a.m. and waking up, early evening is disruptive because you're not getting sunlight exposure, and that can be detrimental to your health. But just going to bed later, as long as it's not a completely flipped schedule, is probably not bad unless it's interfering with the quality of your life.
Okay. Does using blue light glasses help while you're using your computer, watching TV, or reading your iPhone to help reduce insomnia?
It can. The issue is the quality of the blue light glasses. So I use blue light glasses in my day to day, but they're cheap. I ordered them on Amazon. I have no idea if they actually filter blue light. I feel like they do. So cool. But, I don't actually know the quality of these glasses. And so that's something that's coming out as an issue, is that, you just want to look at the quality. Like if you're, I'm not having a lot of problems that caused me to use these glasses. I just figured since I'm on my screen all day, I might as well. But if you're wanting to use it for more of a treatment component, then I would really kind of vet the quality of the glasses that you're using and that it actually filters what it says it's filtering.
Okay. Then we have a question from somebody who's had several sleep studies, and they've shown that they did not reach REM stage 3 or 4. And what do you recommend for patients who have that particular issue?
Yeah, so I would talk to whatever provider ordered these sleep studies. And I would also want to know, like, were you on medication the night you had the sleep studies that could alter that? Also, sleep studies, while they're helpful, are not the perfect solution to everything because it captures one night. And so even if you had a repeat sleep study, they probably weren't consecutive nights in the sleep lab. They were probably periods of time in between the sleep study, I would guess. And so really in a lot of the sleep world, you don't want to look at just one night of sleep because it can vary so much night to night. So I wouldn't be completely freaked out if those were your results. I don't think that means you're never getting REM or you're never getting deep sleep. It probably just means you're not getting, at least with REM, enough. And a lot of times what can help is actually what I mentioned, kind of consolidating your sleep so that you're having more time of uninterrupted sleep, because the interruptions is where the REM sleep gets cut off. So look at how much time you're in bed or scheduling for sleep versus how much time you're sleeping, and maybe try to cut it down a bit so that you're increasing your opportunity for REM.
Okay. And then somebody's asking, what are your thoughts on caffeine and its effect on sleep? Going to sleep, staying asleep, depth of sleep.
Yeah, I mean, just like whoever asked about Concerta, caffeine is a stimulant, so it can impact your sleep. I've worked with a lot of patients that cut out insomnia entirely. I don't know that that's necessary, but what you do want to do is watch when you're consuming it. So what people don't realize is caffeine has a really long half-life. So it stays in your system a lot longer than you would expect. So having caffeine in, the afternoon or at dinner it's going to be in your system when you get in bed at night. So depending on the timing of your sleep, a good rule of thumb is to limit it to the morning. So like after lunchtime, no more caffeine, if you can help it. So that would be my comment on caffeine, is you probably don't have to cut it out entirely. You might want to monitor how much you're taking in and also the timing.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for everything. This was
Yeah.
a wonderful and informative session. We're looking forward to the rest of your sessions this year.
Yeah.
And I hope everybody enjoyed this. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you next month. And everyone have a wonderful week.
See y'all.
Thank you.